They say every architect signs their work. But what if the one design that defined you carried someone else's name? What if the night everyone applauds it, your name isn't even whispered? And what if you walked in, years later, beside a man who actually saw you, only to find that drawing still hanging there? Still beautiful, still stolen. The marble beneath my heels echoed with every step. Slow, intentional. But my breath was anything but calm. Not because I wasn't ready for this room, but because I wasn't sure if the room was ready for me. Thomas's hand rested lightly on the small of my back. A quiet signal. I was here. I wasn't alone. I wasn't the same woman who once stood outside a glass door, waiting to be let into a room she helped build but never belonged to. The National Architectural Forum in New York wasn't new to me. I used to watch it on live streams, back when I still believed merit could outshine charm. But this time, I wasn't tuning in from the edge of my kitchen counter. I was here, in black satin, hair up, lips steady. And beside me was Thomas Graves, not just a billionaire, a builder, in the truest sense. He never tried to make me smaller to fit next to him. If anything, he cleared the sky. We stepped inside the central gallery. Spotlights bounced off the high ceilings like constellations, settling on gleaming displays and glass cases. And then I saw it. My lungs stopped first, then my heels. There, on the far wall, under the exhibit titled Modern Civic Triumphs, hung it. The Northbridge Community Pavilion, or what the plaque beneath it called. Designed by Luke Ramsey, visionary in urban inclusivity. My stomach tightened so suddenly I almost mistook it for hunger. But it wasn't hunger. It was the sharp pull of memory, of betrayal, of knowing every single line of that structure like the bones of your own hand because you sketched it alone, night after night, with only a lamp and a cup of cold coffee beside you. And yet, there it was, with his name, still hanging, still untouched, still wrong. I felt Thomas glance at me. I didn't meet his gaze. My eyes were busy tracing the roof curvature, the one I invented to allow passive airflow. The child-accessible elevation path I fought Luke to include. The angled shadow arc across the southern wall, a detail I knew Luke once mocked for being too poetic. But now it was visionary. I took a small step closer. I don't even remember moving. I hadn't seen that sketch in 5 years, and yet it hadn't aged a day. Unlike me. Back then, I didn't sign it. Not because I didn't want to, but because Luke had said, "Let's hold off on signatures until we finalize pitch materials." I believed him. Of course I did. At the time, he was still my Luke, still the man who kissed my forehead between critiques and whispered, "We're going to change the way this city breathes." Now, 5 years later, I stood beside a different man, one who never needed to borrow my air, one who never told me to dim. And yet, in this moment, I was still the woman staring at her own design like a stranger. I heard soft laughter, camera shutters, and then his voice. Luke. On the far end of the room, surrounded by press and donors. He looked older, a bit more silver at the temples, but still polished. Still magnetic in that way that once felt like gravity, but now just looked performative. I saw him raise his champagne toward the crowd, and standing next to him, her hand resting delicately on his chest, was Madeline Hartley, his fiancée. The event's brochure had called her his muse, the woman who helped reimagine urban warmth through human-centered storytelling. I wanted to laugh, not bitterly, not loudly, just quietly. In the way you laugh when you realize that a punchline was never actually funny. Thomas leaned in, close enough for me to feel the warmth of his words. "Want to stay?" I didn't answer right away, Because this room had once been my sanctuary, and then my exile. And now, it was just a room. But before I could decide if I wanted to stay or leave, I saw the display card under the sketch. And there it was. Luke's name, engraved. And mine, still missing. She stood in front of the microphone, flawless in a pale blue dress, her blonde hair tucked in a soft chignon like she'd just stepped out of a bridal magazine. Madeline Hartley, publicist turned fiancée, the museum's lead curator called her a modern muse to a modern visionary. Muse. I'd heard the word so many times that night, it began to echo inside my skull like a cracked bell. Muse. Like she'd hovered around Luke's genius like perfume, inspiring, ethereal, decorative. I felt Thomas's eyes on me again, gentle, steady. I gave him the kind of half-smile you offer a friend who's just stepped on a wound they didn't know was there, because he didn't know. No one did. Not really. Not about that night. Not about the file I opened on my laptop at 3:17 a.m., with coffee going stale and my eyes dry from squinting at renderings for 12 hours straight. Not about the way my hand trembled when I hit save on the first full draft of the Northbridge Pavilion and labeled it E-Park of One. Not about how I left a note on Luke's desk the next morning saying, "Let me know if you want to tweak the vertical ventilation." And especially not about the way he smiled when I handed it to him. "You're magic," he said. That was before the board meeting, before the pitch, before I saw the presentation slide that carried every line of my drawing, except my initials were gone. Gone. Replaced with Ramsey Studios Prototype A. I'd sat in the back of that glass-walled conference room like a ghost. Luke in his tailored navy blazer, waving confidently at the schematic I built from scratch. "We really pushed for a design that breathes with the community," he said. This was my response to the Northbridge demographic report. I wanted a shape that invited people in. And then he smiled, and they clapped, and I shrank. Because the line he was pointing at, the asymmetrical curve along the eastern elevation, was mine. I had sketched it on the back of a grocery list because I was too broke at the time to buy tracing paper. I remembered thinking, maybe he just forgot. Maybe it was a placeholder name. Maybe he'd fix it before the next meeting. Maybe. But then came the follow-up article, the one in the Seattle Tribune. Headline, "Luke Ramsey's Pavilion, Changing the Shape of Urban Belonging." His face. His quotes. No mention of Evelyn Park. No asterisk. No we. I'd printed the article, highlighted a sentence in yellow, and left it on his desk. When he walked in that morning, he picked it up, read it, then sighed. "Evening, come on. This is how the game works. Don't get emotional." Don't get emotional, like it wasn't my nights, my drafts, my aching neck and red ink corrections and hours debating why kids need shadow arcs in open spaces. "You're the best detail mind I know," he said. "But people buy vision. That's me." I didn't cry then. I don't think I even blinked. I just nodded, packed my laptop, and left early that day. It wasn't the first time he took credit, but it was the first time it broke something I couldn't glue back. Back in the gallery, applause swelled again. Madeline had finished her speech, light and polished, about designs that humanize space. She curtsied slightly. Cameras flashed. Luke joined her on stage, kissed her cheek like they were characters in an ad for champagne and forever. I stayed in the back, still, unapplauding, unnoticed, unmoved. Thomas didn't speak. He didn't need to. He reached down, briefly found my hand and squeezed once. Not possessive, not performative, just real. And it hit me. Maybe the tragedy wasn't that Luke had taken credit. Maybe the real tragedy was that I let him, because I believed love and legacy could share the same roof. But love shouldn't ask you to disappear. And now, standing beneath that framed drawing, watching two people bask in a spotlight that once burned me. I knew I had let it happen. Once, but never again. He used to call it fine-tuning. That was his word for everything I did. I would spend hours adjusting beam angles, calculating shadow flows, experimenting with noise absorption curves in civic spaces. And when I'd bring it to him, polished and layered and thought through, Luke would glance up from his screen and say, "Ah, the Evelyn touch. Perfect for the Polish pass." I told myself it wasn't disrespect, that he was just focused on big picture thinking, that someone had to steer the narrative, speak to the clients, sell the dream. That someone had to be Luke. But slowly, I realized I wasn't collaborating with him anymore. I was cleaning up after him. He'd sketch something in a flash of inspiration, curves that didn't account for drainage, bridges that ignored zoning laws, and then hand it to me with that grin. Do your magic. Make it real. I did. Every time. Because part of me still believed we were building something together, that my logic complemented his vision, that we were yin and yang in steel and glass. But the meetings kept changing. At first, I was in the room, sitting beside him with the models I'd built and the renderings I'd stayed up until 3 a.m. perfecting. He'd refer to me as our design lead or Evelyn, our technical rock star. It was condescending, but at least it was something. Then the seats shifted. I was moved to the back. "We need the client to focus on the dream, not the specs," Luke said. "It's a dance. You get it?" One afternoon, I brought up a materials issue. I had spent days running cost analyses, only to find that the marble Luke wanted would double the project's budget. I laid out alternatives, showed my calculations, even provided aesthetic comparisons. He barely looked at them. "Ev," he said, not looking up. "This is why I do the front-facing work. You get bogged down in the weeds." In the weeds. It stung more than I expected. I wanted to argue, to tell him it wasn't about weeds, it was about foundations. If the footing cracked, the facade didn't matter. But instead, I went quiet. That moment, that language, it changed something. From that day forward, every idea I pitched started to feel like a whisper in a storm. He'd nod, smile, then rewrite it in his own words. There was a concept I proposed. A rotating sun garden in the children's library wing. I had drawn it out of a memory from childhood, sitting alone in a room too dim and too cold, imagining light that could follow you. I showed Luke the mock-up. He looked at it for a long time, then leaned back. "Sweet," he said. "We'll call it the Hartley Halo. Sounds poetic, right?" "Hartley?" I asked. He blinked. Madeline's last name. She had the original spark for the idea. She hadn't. I remembered the conversation. She'd said, "Wouldn't it be nice if kids had more light?" That was it. Luke saw me hesitate. His tone sharpened. "You're getting hung up on attribution again. That's not a good look." That night I went home and stared at my sketches. My hands trembled. Not from anger, but from something colder. I had stopped trusting myself. I had started to believe that maybe I was just the finisher, not the creator. That maybe without him, I wouldn't have anything to build at all. I didn't cry. But I stayed up until morning, redrawing the same garden from memory, this time with no names, no labels, just space, and light, and children who would never know who had drawn it for them. I think I knew, even then, that I was on borrowed ground, that this job, this partnership, this love, it only lasted as long as I didn't ask for more. I stayed quiet, for a little while longer, but the silence was starting to rot. The beginning of the end didn't look like an ending at all. It looked like a Thursday afternoon, late spring. I remember the light in the studio falling through the windows in long golden slants, catching dust motes in the air like glitter. I'd just wrapped a draft proposal for a new mixed-use space in South Terrace, a struggling district on the far edge of the city. I'd spent weeks walking that neighborhood, talking to the people, sketching in notebooks under broken streetlights. I knew the alleyways, the flood-prone corners, the way the wind tunneled between low buildings. I wanted to design something that didn't just stand out, but belonged. So I pitched it. "We extend the civic corridor to South Terrace," I told Luke, unrolling my sketch across the table. "A transit-accessible plaza, integrated community garden, a drop-in childcare space that feeds into the adjacent vocational building. It creates a natural human loop." I was nervous but excited. The lines on the page felt alive. But Luke leaned back in his chair like I'd handed him a tax spreadsheet. "South Terrace," he said, brows raised. "Ev, that's a dead zone. No one's talking about South Terrace." "That's the point," I replied. "No one's investing in it. No one's imagining what it could become. This would set us apart." He let out a small laugh, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "You want us to spearhead a redevelopment initiative in a crime corridor because it feels just?" I stood my ground. "Because it matters, and because it's good design. Look, this isn't charity, it's legacy." Luke's eyes narrowed, sharp and glossy like cut glass. "You still don't get it, do you?" He pushed the sketch away, gently but deliberately. "We're not in the business of legacy. We're in the business of optics. You can be brilliant, Evelyn, but you have no instinct for scale, no instinct for where the real narrative lives." I felt the heat rise in my neck. I'm not pitching a press release. I'm pitching a living system. We've spent years talking about inclusive design, but when it comes down to it, you only want to build where the donors already live. He sighed, leaned forward like a professor tired of correcting the same student. "Look, you're fantastic with mechanics. Form, flow, spatial reasoning. You see 10 layers deep. But big picture? You're too idealistic. That's why you'll always be second seat." Second seat. It rang louder than he probably meant it to. I stepped back, slow. "I didn't know this was a ranked arrangement," I said. He shrugged. "Every team needs a visionary, and every visionary needs someone to make the machine run." For a moment, we just stared at each other. Two people who had once built late nights and whispered deadlines, who had once shared takeout containers over AutoCAD windows and called it romance. Now, we were negotiating my value like it was a line item on a budget sheet. "You're choosing safe over right," I said quietly. "No," he answered. "I'm choosing smart, and someday you'll understand the difference." I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I suddenly realized nothing I said would matter to him unless it came out of his mouth first. That was the real crack. Not in the drawing, not in the business plan, but in us. It had been forming for a long time. Hairline at first, easy to ignore. But now, it split wide open. Later that night, I sat on my apartment floor, barefoot, with my sketch rolled up beside me. I didn't cry. I just stopped. Stopped drawing for a week. Stopped replying to Luke's texts. Stopped believing the word "we" meant anything other than convenience. And maybe, in some quiet part of me, I also started building the blueprint for a life without him. Because if your partner only sees your value in the shadows, you eventually learn to walk toward your own light. It started with a newsletter. I wasn't subscribed. Not really. The firm's PR updates were always self-congratulatory fluff, glossy photos and buzzwords layered over the work of underpaid interns. But that morning, it landed in my inbox anyway. And there it was, right at the top. A spotlight feature on "The Visionary Behind the East Stone Redevelopment." Luke. I blinked. then clicked. It was my project. The one I had pitched, argued for, nearly cried over in that conference room. The one he'd called idealistic, too small, off-brand. Now it was ambitious, community-driven, and a bold step into underinvested spaces. Every quote from Luke was pulled from phrases I had said weeks before, verbatim. The layout even included an early schematic, a rough version I had abandoned and never uploaded to the firm's shared folder. Which meant one thing: he'd taken it from my desk. I sat motionless in my apartment, the soft hum of the morning news in the background fading into static. For a few seconds, I convinced myself I was mistaken. Maybe it was just inspired by mine. Maybe it had evolved into something else. I wanted so badly to believe that this wasn't betrayal. It was coincidence. But deep down, I knew. I didn't call him. I walked straight into the office. It was late enough that the team had already dispersed to project sites or calls, leaving only Luke in his glass-walled corner, perfectly backlit by the skyline like he'd staged it for a photo. He looked up when I entered, mildly surprised, like he hadn't expected to see me again so soon. "You read it," he said. "Is there a version of this conversation where you apologize before I speak?" He leaned back in his chair, unbothered. "Look, Evelyn, you're brilliant. That plan had merit. But it wasn't moving. I gave it weight." I stared at him. "You mean you gave your name to it?" "I gave it wings," he corrected. "You have to understand how this game works." "No," I said. "I really don't think I do. Because where I come from, stealing someone's work and calling it partnership is just theft in a better suit." He sighed, impatient now. "You want credit? Fine. I'll make sure your name is in the second round of press. Maybe even get you a panel seat." A panel seat. It wasn't just that he didn't understand the damage, it was that he didn't even think I should be upset. In his world, I was a cog that should be grateful to be inside the machine at all. I walked out of the office without another word. Back at my desk, I packed quietly. Drafts, notebooks, my sketch roll, a cracked coffee mug from my grad school days that said, "Form follows heart." Everything else could rot. Nobody stopped me. Not one voice in that studio asked where I was going, and maybe that silence was the loudest part of all. That night, I sent in my resignation. No explanations, just a date, a clean end. The next morning, I woke to a single reply from Luke. "Best of luck. No hard feelings." It wasn't anger that hit me, it was clarity. He hadn't lost a partner. He'd lost a mirror that finally stopped reflecting his version of truth. And I'd lost the illusion that staying loyal to someone who doesn't see you somehow makes you visible. The next week, I stopped drawing for him and started sketching what my world might look like, without someone else's name on it. I didn't expect fanfare, but I thought maybe, just maybe, there'd be something. A nod, a glance, a question. Instead, I packed in silence. The studio wasn't large, but it had always felt like the whole world to me. Every inch of it held some version of myself. The rookie who once brewed coffee for late nights. The hopeful designer who scribbled ideas on napkins. The woman who fought to be heard without raising her voice. Now, it was just a cold room with track lighting and too many unspoken truths. I rolled up the sketches one by one, careful not to smudge the pencil lines. Most were drafts no one had ever seen, ideas too tender or strange or impractical to pitch aloud. And none of them bore my signature. I had never signed anything. Because back then, I thought I was building something together. That names didn't matter if the work spoke for itself. I slipped the final roll into my leather tube, latched it shut, and turned toward the bookshelf I had carved out over time. A few design books, dog-eared from rereading, and a small framed photo of my mother and me, taken the day I graduated. She had her arm around me, and her eyes were saying, Don't let anyone shrink you to fit their comfort. I took that photo last. The rest? I left behind. My footsteps felt loud on the concrete floor as I crossed the studio. No one looked up. Melissa, who used to invite me to weekend design tours, now busied herself with the plotter machine. Brian, whose chair had creaked every time he leaned back to ask me questions, was suddenly fascinated with color swatches. And Jackson, who once said I had the sharpest eye in the room, pretended not to see me pass. I could have said goodbye, could have forced the words through the numbness, but I didn't owe them anything anymore. Just as I reached the door, I heard his voice. Luke. Leaving all that talent behind? He called out. I turned. He stood at his office door, arms folded, a smirk almost buried under false concern. Or maybe just tired of being the detail worker. It landed like a slap. Not because I hadn't heard it before, but because even now, with all the damage laid bare, he still clung to the narrative where I was small and he was magnanimous. I looked at him, steady. Details hold up the whole structure, I said. You might want to remember that next time you're standing under one. He opened his mouth, probably to toss back something clever, but I didn't wait. I pushed the door open and stepped into the hallway. The glass swung shut behind me with a hiss. My heartbeat finally caught up, pounding in my ears as I walked toward the elevator. It wasn't bravery. Not really. It was something quieter, heavier. The weight of finally choosing myself. As the elevator doors slid closed, I held that photo of my mother tighter, and I whispered, almost without meaning to, I didn't shrink, Mom. I just outgrew the frame. The metal doors sealed, leaving the studio, and everything I'd once begged to belong to on the other side. The first time I met Thomas, I was terrified my hands would shake the whole presentation out of alignment. It was a late autumn morning, the kind where the air carried both the bite of cold and the smell of pencil shavings and printer ink. I had taken a part-time teaching assistant position at a small community college, less for the paycheck and more for the quiet. Quiet was all I craved after leaving the studio. No clients, no deadlines, no partners who talked over my sentences. But that morning, the department head had asked if I could fill in for a faculty member and present a draft of my design thesis to a group of local educators and visiting community planners. It was informal, he said. Just talk about your ideas. Easy for him to say. He hadn't spent the past few months rebuilding his self-worth from the dust of someone else's spotlight. I had debated saying no, but then I remembered that one design, the one I had sketched on a bench near the old playground after watching a boy in a wheelchair struggle to reach the water fountain. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. A community garden center that doubled as an accessible gathering space for all ages, with benches, curved into spirals for conversation and shade panels made of repurposed glass. So I said yes. I stood in front of a modest group of educators, city planners, and a few bored-looking grad students, with my oversized printouts on foam boards and a voice that tried not to tremble. I explained the curvature of the space, the sun paths, the way the glass panels could capture light differently in winter and summer. I talked about community input, about inclusion, about dignity. When I finished, there was polite clapping. A few nodded. A couple checked their phones. Then he raised his hand. A tall man near the back, leaning forward in his chair as if weighing every inch of what I'd said. Why spirals? He asked. I blinked. Excuse me? The benches. You could have gone with circles, squares, but you chose spirals. Why? No one had asked me that before. People usually asked about budget, or feasibility, or parking, but never why. I answered honestly. Because a spiral doesn't close on itself. It leaves room for movement, for growth. I wanted people to sit down and feel like there was still somewhere to go. He nodded once. No smile, no praise, just an understanding that felt more solid than applause. Afterward, as people filtered out, he approached. I noticed then that he carried a leather notebook instead of a tablet, and his blazer was slightly frayed at the cuffs. "Evelyn, right?" he said. "I'm Thomas. I run a nonprofit that's trying to convert an old library into a multi-use community space. I'd like to show you the building sometime." I was stunned. "Why me?" He raised an eyebrow. "Because you didn't just draw a building. You drew a belief." It stopped me cold. Not because it was flowery, but because it was the first time in years someone saw what I had tried to say, not just how I said it. That evening, I sat on the old futon in my studio apartment, staring at the copy of my design spread out across the floor. I thought of Luke, how he used to scan my drafts with a red pen and say, "Nice details," before scribbling his name at the top. Thomas hadn't praised the lines. He had asked what they meant. And for the first time in a long while, I remembered what it felt like to be seen. Not as support, not as background, but as a voice with something to say. I told him no the first time he asked. We were standing in the old library he wanted to renovate. The floor creaked with every step, and dust floated like tiny memories through the slant of afternoon light. He had just finished walking me through his vision. Reading spaces, language classes, accessible workstations, a rooftop greenhouse. When he paused near a broken window and turned to me, I already knew what he was going to say. "I'd like you to lead the design," Thomas said simply. I laughed. Not bitter, just automatic. Number thank you, but no. His brows pinched. "Why not?" I shrugged and avoided his eyes. "I'm not that kind of designer. Not anymore. I draw ideas, not blueprints, and I'm not licensed to stamp anything official. That's not what I'm asking for. I can't lead a project like this." He leaned back against the old wooden railing. "Why not?" There was a long pause. I was suddenly aware of my shoes, the crack in the tile, the old radiator wheezing behind us. I sighed. Because people like me aren't the ones they listen to when the budget is tight. Because I don't have the name, the firm, the presence. Because I've already had my work claimed by someone who did. Thomas stayed quiet for a beat, then gestured toward the sketchbook I hadn't realized I was clutching in my bag. "Can I see something?" I hesitated, then pulled out the latest drawing. A rough draft of a flexible reading nook that transformed into a children's storytelling circle with collapsible walls made of canvas and wood. He didn't look at the lines first. He scanned the whole thing, then asked, "Why the fabric walls?" "For sound absorption," I said automatically. "Also easier to reconfigure?" He shook his head. I mean, why choose something soft?" I blinked. Because hard spaces aren't welcoming, and because kids deserve quiet corners that can shift when they need space. He smiled, but not in a patronizing way. That's what I thought. Then he looked at me in a way that made me feel seen down to the bones. "You keep saying you're not the kind of designer people listen to," he said. "But I think you're exactly the kind of voice this place needs. You don't just design what people use. You design how they feel when they use it." I didn't have a response. So he just added, "Think about it. You don't owe me anything, but you might owe something to that part of yourself you keep shelving." That night, I sat on my balcony with my old drawings spread across the floor, the city humming in the background. I found one sketch I hadn't looked at in months, the very first version of the spiral bench. In the corner was a tiny note I'd written in the margin, "Leave space for breath." Luke had once crossed that out with a red pen, writing, "Too abstract. Keep it technical." Thomas, though, had stared at that same line and nodded like it made perfect sense. He hadn't tried to fix it. He'd asked what it meant. Maybe, I thought, that was the real difference. One man needed my silence to feel louder. The other heard something even when I didn't speak. And maybe that was the kind of foundation I wanted to build on. They called my name twice. I wasn't in the room either time. The ceremony was being held in a converted warehouse downtown, all steel beams and hanging lights and carefully catered hope. The community redevelopment project had been chosen as one of the state's 5 most impactful urban renewal initiatives of the year. It was a big deal. Cameras, mayors, panels, and I didn't go. Not because I was ungrateful, but because I was terrified. I had helped lead the design, worked side by side with Thomas and the local team for almost 10 months. We'd turned that broken-down building into a space where single moms could co-work, while their kids attended free classes just a hallway away. We added wheelchair-accessible reading pods, a garden that school kids now managed after class, even a quiet room with just soft music and nothing else, for anyone who needed to step away from the noise of the world. But when the invitation came with my name embossed on it, something inside me shrank. I told Thomas, "You should go. It's your vision." He had stared at me like I'd just spoken in a language he didn't understand. Then he leaned forward and said gently, "Evelyn, when are you going to stop building staircases you won't climb?" I tried to brush it off. "I'm just not the face for this kind of thing." "You don't have to be a face," he said. "Just be a presence. You earned that." I still didn't go. The next morning, I saw the clip. Someone had sent me the live stream recording. Thomas stood on the stage, alone, in front of a massive projection of the building we'd brought to life. When they handed him the award, he accepted it with a small nod, then adjusted the mic. "This isn't mine," he said. "The real architect behind this isn't here today, but she should be." There was a pause. "Her name is Evelyn Reyes. You haven't seen her speak, but you've felt her work." He held up the award but didn't raise it like a trophy. He just looked down at it thoughtfully and continued. "I once told her that she had to learn how to walk upstairs, not just build them for others." A light laugh scattered through the audience. He added, "The funny thing is, she already has. I just hope someday she realizes how far up she's already brought the rest of us." That line stayed with me. Later that night, I sat by the spiral bench outside the community center, the one that wraps around a tree we planted on the very first day of construction. There was a child napping there, his book still open on his chest. A mom sat nearby, her eyes closed, breathing in peace. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I had something to prove. I had built something real. I had left a trace. Even if I hadn't climbed the stage, my name had still been called. A week after the ceremony I didn't attend, Thomas knocked on the door of my tiny home studio carrying a takeout bag, a manila folder, and a look that said he wasn't leaving anytime soon. He didn't say anything at first, just handed me a box of Thai food and nodded toward the folder. "This one's hotter than last time," he warned, referring to the noodles, not the paperwork. Then he sat on the floor, back against the wall, and waited while I opened the envelope. Inside were incorporation documents, a logo draft I didn't remember making but had definitely sketched during one of our coffee-stained brainstorming sessions, and a name, Upward Studio. I frowned. "Is this yours?" Thomas looked up, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Ours, if you say yes." I stared at the folder. To what, exactly? To building something without needing anyone's permission, without waiting to be given a room, or a nameplate, or a voice. We build the table. We name the chairs. We print your name on the damn ceiling if that's what it takes. I sat down slowly beside him, chopsticks still in hand. "You don't need me to sign off on this, Thomas. You could have done it without me." His voice softened, but I didn't want to. I didn't want the architecture without the architect. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small tin. Not a ring box, Not even close. I blinked. Are you proposing with Altoids? He laughed, nervous, quiet, then opened the tin to reveal a key. It's for the new space, upstairs from the community center. It's a mess right now, but it's ours. There's a skylight. Some exposed beams I know you'll hate, but it's blank. Waiting. I held the key in my hand. Cold. Real. I don't know what to say, I whispered. You always know what to say, he replied. You just sometimes forget that your voice matters as much as your lines. I was still processing when he added, almost shyly, we can design this thing together, Evelyn. The business, the projects, the life. No hierarchy, no title games. Just you, as you are, and me, as I am. We name the thing we build. Together. I looked at the forms again. He hadn't signed them yet. The signature line under co-founder was blank, left for me. No ring, no kneeling, no flowers. Just a key, a blank canvas, and someone who saw what I built and wanted to build more. Not in my shadow, not over my shoulder, but beside me. I was always told that the person who loves you, I said quietly, will want to give you the world. Thomas shook his head. That's not love. That's pressure. I just want to give you back your own blueprint. I smiled. Well, maybe I'll change the logo. He grinned. Only if you make it uglier. We stayed there for hours, talking about nothing and everything, eating 2 spicy noodles off blueprints and tracing dreams with our fingers. That night, I didn't say yes in words, but I went upstairs. I opened the door to the dusty loft with the ugly beams, and I started sketching. He saw me before I saw him. I was adjusting the strap of my bag when Thomas nudged my elbow slightly, a quiet gesture that said, "Look." I turned, and there he was, Luke, standing under the arched entryway of the gallery's east wing, wearing a navy suit I recognized too well. Hair trimmed, posture perfect, smile, painted, on like a mural that had started to peel. And then our eyes met. It was barely a second, maybe less, but something shifted. Luke's hand was still resting on Madeline's lower back, fingers splayed in that performative way he used to do in photos, an orchestrated tenderness. Madeline was mid-laugh, radiant in a cream dress, her hair pinned with a silver comb. She hadn't noticed me, not yet, but Luke had. And in that instant his entire body language faltered, his hand froze, his shoulders drew in a fraction, and his smile, oh, that smile everyone once said could sell sand to the desert, didn't quite make it to his eyes. I'd prepared for this moment in theory 1,000 times. What I'd say, what I'd wear, how composed I'd be. I had imagined walking in with my work displayed, my name in print, an effortless look over my shoulder and a poetic line like, "You don't get to critique what you never helped build." But instead, I just stood there, human, not triumphant, not petty, just present. Luke excused himself from Madeline under some pretense, water, maybe, and crossed the room toward the refreshments. Not toward me, but close enough for me to read the silent monologue in his eyes. You came, you look different, you survived, and I had. Not with fanfare, not with revenge, but with quiet persistence, with early mornings, empty sketch pads, and the kind of patience that doesn't demand applause. Thomas leaned in, voice low. You okay? I nodded. It's strange. I thought I'd feel fire, or frost, but it's just weather. He chuckled. Well, weather changes. But you? You built shelter. I watched as Luke stood still near the display of hors d'oeuvres, looking everywhere except at me. Madeline joined him moments later, looping her arm through his. She glanced around the room, clearly unaware of the undercurrent. Her gaze skipped right over me until she saw Thomas. Recognition sparked. She whispered something to Luke, and he stiffened further. I could have walked away, could have avoided whatever was about to happen. But instead, I adjusted my scarf and turned toward the installation room, the one where Thomas and I had curated the community housing display. Our names were etched side by side on the plaque. I didn't look back. If he followed, that would be his choice. But I had already made mine. He approached slowly, like someone stepping into a memory they weren't sure they were welcome in. I was standing near the central exhibit, pretending to check the notes beside one of the community prototypes, though I knew them by heart. Thomas had stepped aside to greet a group from the university, giving me a moment alone. I felt him before I heard him, that particular stillness when someone enters your orbit without words. Evelyn, Luke said behind me, low, careful, like the syllables might shatter. I turned, not startled, just prepared. He looked older, not in the way of gray hairs or wrinkles, but the kind of age that comes from confronting the consequences of your own decisions and realizing too late that some doors don't just stay open. I didn't know you'd be here, he offered. I figured. My voice was calm, unapologetically mine. You never really looked back. There was a pause. He glanced toward the piece beside us, the model of a shared studio co-op that Thomas and I had been developing in the mountains. A place for underfunded young designers. A place Luke would have once mocked. This is yours? He asked, gesturing vaguely. Ours, I corrected gently. Thomas and I co-designed it. Luke nodded, then rubbed the back of his neck. It's thoughtful, visionary. Not what I would have imagined back then. I almost laughed, but the ache was too distant to feel bitter anymore. You said I lacked vision, I reminded him. You called me a detail worker. He winced. That word still hurt. Maybe more now. I was wrong, he said simply. There was a silence between us then, heavy but not hostile. He shifted, hands in his pockets. If I could do it all over, he began, eyes finally meeting mine, I'd sign your name first. It wasn't a full apology, not the kind I used to crave, but it was more than I expected. Still, I didn't flinch. I didn't smile. I didn't want my name first, I replied quietly. I just wanted it there. Luke's shoulders dropped a little, as if something unspoken finally landed. I stepped closer, not to bridge a gap, but to make something clear. You remember the sketch? I asked. The one we drafted over takeout boxes and bad wine? You ran with it, pitched it without me. It ended up on that downtown project proposal. Madeline told the press it was yours. He opened his mouth, maybe to defend himself, maybe to deny it. I didn't let him. I never signed it, I said. You know why? Because some things aren't just about credit. They're about trust. And you erased that before I could even lift the pen. He looked down. For the first time in a long time, he didn't have a retort. Behind us, Thomas was laughing with one of the visiting students. Madeline was talking to a curator, still unaware of the undercurrent flowing a few steps away. I inhaled slowly, then smiled, not at Luke, but at myself. You know, I said softly, I used to imagine this moment, where you'd say sorry and I'd feel vindicated. But standing here now, I realize I don't need it. Luke looked up, eyes searching mine. Then why did you stay long enough to hear me? I paused, then answered gently. Because closure isn't something people give you. Sometimes it's something you watch yourself grow into. He didn't stop me as I turned away. Didn't call after me. Didn't say her name. And I didn't need to look back to know the truth. Some drawings don't need signatures to be finished. Some chapters close with silence, and some goodbyes are quiet not because they're weak, but because they're finally enough. It was a Tuesday night. Quiet. Hollow. the kind of stillness that made fluorescent lights buzz louder than they should. I was the last one in the studio. Everyone else had left hours ago, their chairs askew, coffee mugs still warm. Luke had gone too, off to dinner with a client or maybe Madeline. He hadn't said. By then, he didn't need to. On my desk sat the final draft. The one we'd argued over for weeks. The one I'd poured myself into. Sketch after sketch. Refining every detail to make the vision whole. We'd agreed on the structure, on the flow of the space. But when it came to authorship, he was silent. And silence, I'd learned, could be more brutal than a rejection. There, in the bottom corner, was the placeholder. Just a line, waiting for a name. My name. I sat in the chair for a long time, watching the ink in my pen dry. I remember reaching for it, uncapping it, hovering, then stopping. What was it I wanted? Recognition? Equality? Or just proof that I mattered in the space I helped build? But all I could hear were his words from earlier that week. You're good with detail, Evelyn. But this kind of vision, it needs leadership. Leadership. As if I hadn't carried this project on my back for months. I set the pen down. Then, quietly, deliberately, I took the eraser from my drawer and wiped the space clean. Not his name, not mine. Nothing. I left the corner blank. Because in that moment I didn't believe I was worthy. Not of the credit. Not of the fight. Not even of the ink. That was the night I decided to leave. And now, years later, standing beside Thomas in a gallery filled with my ideas made real, I finally understand the weight of that erasure. It wasn't humility. It was grief. Grief over the version of me that still waited for someone else to say I was enough. Thomas squeezed my hand gently. "Are you okay?" he asked. I looked toward the model exhibit, our community center, now almost fully funded, and nodded. "I am," I said. Then I turned to him and added, "I was right to walk away. Not with bitterness, not as a weapon, just as a fact. Because the truth is, leaving wasn't about Luke. It was about choosing to stop asking for permission. It was about signing my life with intention, not ink. And that blank corner? It doesn't ache anymore, because I finally filled it, not with a name, but with a future." Madeline was laughing with a group of guests near the champagne table, her red dress catching light like a warning flare. The moment her gaze swept across the room and landed on us, on me, standing next to Thomas, it felt like the music stuttered, just for a beat. Her expression faltered, only slightly. Just enough that someone watching closely would notice the muscles behind her eyes tighten, the polite curve of her lips go rigid. But then she tilted her head and raised her glass, the picture of poise. Thomas didn't see her at first. He was too busy helping an elderly architect adjust her headset to better hear the panel speakers. That was Thomas. Always focused on who was right in front of him, never looking past someone to search for the next rung of a ladder. But I noticed. And Madeline noticed that I noticed. She crossed the room, slow and deliberate, her heels announcing her before her voice did. "Evelyn?" she greeted. Her voice was warm, too warm, like tea brewed long after the bag had gone bitter. "I didn't know you were still involved in the field." I smiled gently. "Still sketching, still dreaming. You know how it is." Thomas turned just then, wiping his hands on a napkin. "Madeline," he said simply, offering no further context, no unnecessary compliments, no long-winded reminiscing about gallery days or shared donors. She extended a hand. "I don't think we've formally met." "We have," he replied, briefly, "at last year's summit. You were with Luke." The way he said Luke's name, neutral, unburdened, stripped it of the power it once held over me. Madeline's eyes darted between us. I heard your joint project got federal attention. Congratulations. Thank you, Thomas said, but he was looking at me. Though the vision, the heart of it, that's all Evelyn. There it was again, that quiet, deliberate naming. The kind I used to beg for. Madeline caught it too. I saw her brace herself, the way one does before stepping onto uncertain ground in stiletto heels. Well, she said, glancing around the exhibit as if trying to find a reason to stay. Luke will be thrilled to know you're thriving. He always said you had potential. Potential. The word hung in the air like cheap perfume, meant to flatter, but stinging the senses. I didn't rise to it. Sometimes it takes losing the wrong people to find the right path, I said. Not sharp, not cruel, just truth wrapped in silk. Madeline's smile thinned. Yes, well, some of us stay on the path we choose. I wanted to laugh, because I remembered the way she used to orbit Luke like a planet to a dying sun, chasing warmth that never quite reached her. But I didn't laugh. Instead, I turned to Thomas, and without hesitation, he slipped his arm around my waist. His gesture wasn't performative, it was grounding, natural, and real. Excuse us, he said gently to Madeline. We promised to meet the local councilman before the keynote. Madeline nodded, stepping aside, her earrings catching the light like chimes in a storm. As we walked away, I didn't look back. But I knew in my bones, that she had. And in that look, she saw the one thing she couldn't imitate, couldn't perform her way into. Someone loving me not for where I stood, but for who I chose to become. Sun was sharp that morning, cutting clean shadows across the courtyard of the new Community Design Center. Someone had laid rows of folding chairs in near-perfect symmetry, as if symmetry alone could calm the nerves I hadn't been able to shake for days. Thomas was already there when I arrived. He was talking to a group of students pointing toward the south wing where the shade trees we'd planned were beginning to take root. The breeze carried their laughter, light and youthful, and for a second, I forgot the tightness in my chest. I walked slowly, letting my heels echo softly against the smooth flagstone. At the heart of the courtyard stood the dedication stone, simple, rectangular, unpretentious. The project's name was etched across the top, and underneath, in delicate serif lettering, Lead Designer, Evelyn Ward. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't elevated in gold or polished brass, just stone. Firm, quiet, permanent. I reached out, brushing my fingertips against the groove of my name, not to confirm it was real. Thomas had shown me the proof weeks ago, but to remind myself that I had said yes, that I'd finally said yes to being seen. Thomas came to stand beside me. He didn't say anything right away. He didn't need to. After a while, he offered me a coffee in a paper cup, the kind from the cafe we both loved. I took it with a nod, and we stood there in stillness as the guests arrived. Later, when the speeches began, I let him do most of the talking. That had always been our rhythm. He spoke. I built. But when the city official called my name to step forward for the ribbon cutting, I didn't hesitate. I walked up, smiled for the photos, and said only one sentence into the microphone. I drew this center as a place where no one would have to ask for permission to belong. There was a pause, then soft applause. Not roaring, not forced. Just enough. That night, after the crowd had thinned and the caterers were packing up, I returned to the courtyard alone. I sat on the bench beneath the newly planted elm tree and looked at my name again. For years, I'd imagined this moment as something explosive, a reckoning, a triumph. But sitting there, in the hush of dusk, it felt like something better. Not vindication, just peace. I didn't want my credit back because I needed it to prove something. I wanted it so I could finally stop chasing shadows. A child ran past, laughing as she waved a folded program in the air like a paper bird. Her mother called after her, and together they disappeared into the glow of the street lamps. And in the stillness that followed, I whispered the words I'd never dared speak aloud. I forgive him. Not for his sake, but for mine. Because today, the only thing I wanted more than acknowledgement was quiet. And I had it. At last. As twilight melted into the blue hush of early evening, the skyline of New York shimmered like a promise half-whispered. Lights flickered on one by one. In office buildings I used to dream about working in, back when I thought success was defined by how close you sat to the top floor. Thomas and I stood on the rooftop of the community center. The official ceremony was long over, but we hadn't wanted to leave just yet. The city looked different from up here. Softer, less demanding. I could see the outlines of neighborhoods where I once ran between design jobs and late-night classes, chasing deadlines and approval in equal measure. My fingers wrapped around the railing, the steel cool and familiar. I took a deep breath. Below us, through the windows of the studio wing, I could see a few young interns still sketching. They were laughing, gesturing toward the boards, debating ideas, fearless and full of questions. One of them had pinned up a draft with lines so raw, so open, it reminded me of the first time I drew without worrying who would take credit. Thomas slipped an arm around my waist. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. He had always been the one who didn't need to speak over my silence. He just stood beside it, steady. We watched as the city pulsed. Cars in streams of red and white, a plane crossing overhead, a siren in the distance fading too quickly to feel like an emergency. I thought back to the girl I used to be, standing in Luke's studio, invisible in plain sight, hiding my initials in the corner of the page. I had spent so much of my life afraid of being seen fully, afraid that if someone really looked, they'd decide I wasn't enough. But now, my name was etched in stone, in glass, on grant letters, in bylaws. More importantly, it was in the mouths of students I mentored, colleagues who invited me to the table, communities who saw my designs as more than aesthetic. They saw them as bridges, built from the inside out. I leaned my head against Thomas's shoulder. In the distance, fireworks began to bloom above the East River. Early Independence Day celebrations. They painted the sky with color and memory. I used to think I needed that kind of light. Flashy, undeniable, public. Now I knew better. My voice, steady, reflective, at peace, drifted softly as the screen faded to the final image, a woman standing quietly on a rooftop, wind brushing her hair, the city aglow behind her. Voiceover. I never needed the spotlight. Just a design I didn't have to hide my name on anymore. Fade to black. Then, a simple sketch appears on screen. An outline of a small building, open doors, trees sketched beside it. Beneath it, 2 names signed, side by side. Evelyn Ward Thomas Ellis. And below that, in gentle font. Built by those who believe in quiet beginnings. The final note lingers. Soft piano playing under the credits. An invitation, not a declaration. Because some stories don't end in applause, they end in peace.